Hey, it's me, Lars Larson. Thanks for checking out my podcast, and be sure to tell a friend about the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. There's a lot to talk about on a Tuesday night. I've got to mention the fact that just a couple of hours ago, a jury has decided in the case involving Donald Trump and E. Jean Carroll, a lady who says that Donald Trump raped her. The jury decided he did not rape her. They did decide that he sexually abused her. They did decide that he defamed her, and they've now ordered $5 million in damages paid. So he's been found liable for sexually abusing and defaming E. Jean Carroll. So we'll get that out in front of everybody. Do I expect that there will be an appeal of that decision? Absolutely, I do. And I guess the thing I'd want to ask somebody, I've never been accused of any kind of sexual crime at all. Now, of course, they've been accusing Donald Trump ever since he went from just Donald Trump on TV to Donald Trump running for president. And of course, the media hates him. The left hates him. Half the Republican Party hates him. Frankly, I thought he was one of the best presidents ever, and he'll make a great president in the fall of next year. And the left is practically apoplectic trying to figure out how can we block this guy. Well, I don't think it's going to happen. And I do think that Joe Biden is his own worst enemy because he apparently thinks he's doing a great job. But about Donald Trump, I think what's going to happen in this case is there will be an appeal. And I guess what I would ask anybody is if you say something happened to you 30 years ago and there's an accusation brought against you from 30 years ago, how would you defend that? I mean, I'm inclined to ask men especially, were you married 30 years ago? Oh, no, I was single. Did you go out with any young ladies? Did you interact with any young ladies? Well, yes, I did. If one of them accused you of what Donald Trump was accused of, and today Trump says he doesn't even know who this woman is, doesn't recognize her, how would you defend yourself? And one of the toughest things you might ever be called upon to do is prove what you didn't do. Most of us can prove fairly easily what we did do. Do you have a driver's license, Lars? Yes. Do I have a concealed carry permit? Yes. Have you ever been to Seattle, and could you prove you've been to Seattle or to New York City or to Los Angeles or Washington, D.C.? I can prove. I've got ticket stubs. I've got airline records. I've got all that. I can prove what I did do. How do you prove what you didn't do? And how do you do it 30 years after the fact? It really, in this case, came down to a he said, she said. Trump decided not to testify. His deposition was not exactly a perfect thing, as he once called the Ukraine phone call. But still in all, I think Donald Trump is known to Americans. And the ones who love him will love him all the way to the end of his presidency, which he will reassume in January of 2025. And the ones who hate him with such a passion, I think literally he could invent the best thing since sliced bread, and those people would still hate him. In any case, that's on the agenda. But welcome to the program. If you want to jump into what we call the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Send your emails to talk@larslarson.com, and especially since Trump is on the agenda, at least part of the agenda on today's show, I'll say naysayers go to the head of the line. You call the show and tell the producers that you disagree with me and you don't want to prove me wrong. We'll be glad to put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. You can send those emails to talk@larslarson.com. And, of course, you can answer our Twitter poll. Let me tell you about that first because I found this interesting. I think that any baby born to anyone in the United States, or frankly anywhere on planet Earth, is a blessing from God. Let me say that first. I have nothing against that. But I do think that kids are owed an obligation by their parents, by the people who create them. Well, God created them, but, people were involved, and you know the process. So when I read the news that Robert De Niro, who I think is a fine actor, and his political positions are idiotic. But, having said that, he does a great job of acting, and he should stick to acting. His politics are as screwed up as you can imagine. He has now become a dad at age 79. And I thought, well, I may have a little bit of a dog in the fight. You decide. And that is, my parents were both more than 40 years old when I was born. Now, that means they were old enough that you could easily imagine people that age being grandparents, depending on when you decide to have kids. If you get to the age of 20 and get married and have kids, and then your kids have babies at 20, you could be 40, 41, 42 years old and be a grandparent. Robert De Niro is old enough to be a great-great-grandparent to his newest child, his seventh child, who has just recently, I don't know the exact date and time, but has just recently become Robert De Niro's seventh child. And when I thought about that, I thought, well, there were a lot of things about having a much older dad. When I was 15 years old, my dad would have been 57 years old. Like I said, old enough conceivably to be my granddad. Was that the best situation in the world? I would say no. And in fact, I had a lot of friends whose dads were a lot younger, and that changes the relationship, the things you do, the other activities you participate in with your dad and with your mom. I think it's better when there is not as many decades between the age of the parent and the age of the child. Now, does that mean it's not still a blessing for Robert De Niro to have a brand new child? But I thought, I want to ask a question about this. So I'm going to ask you in the Twitter poll, Robert De Niro will be in his mid-90s if he's still around, and let's hope he is, even though his politics are screwed up. I don't wish an ill end to anybody. But Robert De Niro will be in his mid-90s when his latest child is a teenager. Now, think about that for a moment. Should anybody this old be making babies? And I would say no. I think it cheats the child. I thought the same thing when Tony Randall, I think at the age of 75 or so, he had a 25-year-old wife. Okay, fine, whatever works for you. I wouldn't question their relationship, but what I would question is this. When you're 75 like Tony Randall was and your child is born, that means you're going to be 90 when your child turns 15, your son or daughter. Is that fair to the child? I don't think it is. And that's my gut instinct in any case. So you can answer the Twitter poll. Robert De Niro will be in his mid-90s when his latest child is a teenager. Should anybody that old be making babies? I know you're capable of it. I'm asking not do you have the right to do it, but whether it's the right thing to do. Today's Twitter poll can be found at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I've always believed in, so I joined a long time ago. You can join too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better for you and better for America. Coming up this hour, if China invades Taiwan, are American assets and citizens in danger? Did John Kerry, the climate czar for President Biden, fly his private jet to attend the coronation of King Charles III over the weekend while wearing his, he said, discarded military medals? I'll talk about that as well. Do we need to put a much larger focus on creating low-cost medical and dental treatments? And I'll tell you about that too. And take just a moment to cast a vote in that Twitter poll at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Coming up in a moment, we will talk about China and Taiwan and the American assets that may be at risk. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Tuesday, and your calls are welcome at 866-HEY-LARS. America has assets and citizens all over this planet, especially in our allied countries. So how much danger are Americans in if China invades Taiwan? We certainly wouldn't want it to end up the way that both Sudan and Afghanistan turned out for Americans who were trapped there by a feckless commander-in-chief. Frank Gaffney joins me now, the founder of the Center for Security Policy. Frank, welcome back.
It's good to be with you, Lars.
What should we do in anticipation of the fact that China has rattled sabers about Taiwan for decades? They've threatened the country, and we do have a lot of assets there, including citizens and companies and others. What do we do in preparation for the fact that we don't know when China might ever decide this is the opportune moment to seize another country and try to drag it into the communist fold?
Well, if I may answer that question in a roundabout way.
Sure.
I'd like to just tell your audience, which has been so gracious and welcoming of me, as have you, of course, that we have a big day today. This day is the publication day of a new book that I've written called The Indictment, the subtitle of which is Prosecuting the Chinese Communist Party and Friends for Crimes Against America, China, and the World. And the thing that's so exciting is that today it has been listed as the number one best-selling book in the national and international security category at Amazon.com. Right out of the gate. And I want to thank, folks like I think your audience for helping make that possible on the basis of pre-orders. The reason I say all of that by way of prelude, Lars, is the book is all about what the Chinese Communist Party is up to, obviously.
Right.
It's focused on not just the unrestricted warfare that it has been engaged in, as you know, for decades against us, but also the people in this country like Joe Biden, Commander-in-Chief of the United States military, who has been captured by the Chinese and helping them take us down, which brings us to the question about Taiwan. The Chinese, I believe, under Xi Jinping, and I don't mean the Chinese people, of course, I mean the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
And its armed force, that is to say, not the people's military, even though they call it the People's Liberation Army, it's the party's military, built up over these years by American financiers who have sent our money, our pension funds, our 501k, 401k plans and mutual funds and so on to China, and they've used a lot of it to build a military that gives Xi Jinping now, and this brings us to your point, the option to engage in military warfare of the old-fashioned kind, the shooting warfare against Taiwan, yes, but against us as well. And I'll just bring this to a close by saying today, Lars, we did an unbelievably impressive and alarming webinar of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, which has been the feedstock, these webinars. We've done something like 75 of them in the past 10 months for the book, The Indictment. And this particular one today talks about the Chinese People's Liberation Army elements that we believe are now part of that invasion force coming in across our open border in the south and maybe even the north as well in significant numbers and with, we believe, unfortunately, the intention as part of a shooting war against the United States to make mayhem here in our own nation. So this is a bit of a dose of salt, I'm afraid. People need to read this book, I think. People need to take aboard, especially the action items. We've got 20 of them that I think have still a chance of helping us deter China from going into Taiwan, deter the Chinese Communist Party from attacking us as well.
Well, how do we go about, though? Because you brought it up, and we brought it up before. We've now got illegal aliens coming into this country from more than 140 countries, including from communist China. Now, some of them may be just trying to escape, the evil clutches of a communist dictatorship, and I can't fault them for wanting to do that. But they're apparently paying large sums of money to the cartels in Mexico to get them across the border, much larger than apparently a lot of the conventional day-to-day illegal aliens pay to come across. How do we know which ones of those are actually assets of communist China? And how do we even manage to keep an eye on them if they're in our country illegally? But Joe Biden is simply saying, write them up a piece of paper and send them on their way by the thousands of them coming into this country, millions if you count all the illegals, but the ones from China, thousands or tens of thousands. How do we guard against that?
Well, it's the right question to be asking. And the answer is the first thing, it's like any problem. You got to know the nature of the problem. And one of the people who contributed to the program is a war correspondent. I'm sure you've talked with him at some point over the years by the name of Michael Yon.
No, Michael Yon's great. I very much I trust him. Yeah, he is.
He did a really, really important contribution to the program. Unfortunately, he didn't, in the pre-recorded video that he sent us, didn't talk in this context, in this webinar, about the specific question you asked, but one of our other colleagues had spoken to him earlier in the week, a fellow by the name of Sam Faddis, fabulous former career intelligence officer for us, for the good guys. He said that Michael Yon had told him that what he is seeing coming up through the Darien Gap in Panama is substantial numbers of military age, unaccompanied young Chinese nationals who seem to be all equipped with the same, backpacks or other gear, and they seem to be operating in units, moving as groups. Now, what that suggests to me is that the problem that we have is a military People's Liberation Army operation that is now heading our way. And what you have to do with it is you have to seal the border. That's the thing you have to do about it, and you have to do it right quick because they're going to be part of, as you know, Lars, an enormous infusion of people waiting to come in when Title 42 is lifted on Thursday.
Yep.
So, Biden is talking about sending 1,500 guys to the border. We ought to be sending a division down there immediately and mobilizing National Guards all across that border, and we ought to be making sure nobody comes in without permission, especially Chinese People's Liberation Army units.
And by the way, Frank, you know that all of us wish for that, and we know the likelihood of it happening anytime under the Biden administration or maybe, in the next 2 years, the Harris administration is virtually zero, isn't it?
Well, I don't know. I think it really depends on us, Lars. What we're trying to do with this book, The Indictment, is to arouse the American people to realize this isn't just the replacement of our population with anybody who wants to come here from around the world, which is how it's kind of been packaged so far. We're talking about a military invasion for the purposes of destroying our country and killing our people. I think that the Americans who live here are not going to stand for that as they learn more about the true nature of what's going on and the complicity of the President of the United States and his administration in doing it to them. And I think that is going to catalyze things. I think it is going to compel governors, if not this president, and hopefully this military, this Defense Department. They have done everything they can to get good people out of the United States military and to put on top of them people who are no good, frankly.
Yep.
But there are still many, many military personnel, and I've dealt with quite a number of them in Northern Command, among other places, where they have the responsibility of the U.S. Army for protecting us here at home. And I think they will respond to the pressure and the demands and the pleas of the American people for protection. We need
You've got to check out this brand new book by Frank Gaffney, founder of the Center for Security Policy. Frank, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate it. It is a Tuesday. Coming up in a moment, Joe Biden's climate czar, John Kerry, spotted over the weekend wearing his military medals. Remember the ones he said he gave back or threw over the fence at the White House back during the Nixon administration? He's back to wearing those medals again. We'll talk about it next. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Tuesday. Your calls are welcome, but I got to talk about John Kerry. Now, I will admit this. If you say, but Lars, you have a bias. Yes, I have a bias. I think that John Kerry is a snake. I think that John Kerry is dishonest. I think that John Kerry, I guess you have to give him credit for having got money the old-fashioned way, married into it by, incidentally, marrying two very wealthy women in a row when he wasn't worth about 10 cents at the time. That's how he got his money. So what does he do? He has a yacht, he has a nice house, and as I said, he got it the old-fashioned way by marrying into it. And now, for Joe Biden as the climate czar, John Kerry loves to climb on a private jet, whether it's paid for by him or paid for by the American taxpayers, and he'll fly all over the world to tell everybody how much fossil fuel we should not be using. And right after he tells us that, he hops on another jet and flies somewhere else at great public expense in some cases, at great private expense, I'm sure, in others. Although a smart guy like John Kerry, if you can get the taxpayers to pay the bill, that's always preferable, right? But you need to remember a few other things about John Kerry. And I'll say this, because I always disclose my dog in the fight. My mom and dad served in the military. I did not. It wasn't because I had any aversion to the military. I could have gone in 77 when I graduated, 77 when I graduated high school. I would have been out in 81, and nothing much at all happened there. It wasn't an aversion to it, but I just didn't see at that point that it was right for the military, right for me. Okay, I didn't serve. John Kerry did. John Kerry went to Vietnam. John Kerry earned a bunch of medals. And then he did something that, as far as I'm concerned, erased not his service to America in uniform in a war, but coming back and declaring in television interviews and before the Congress, he declared that all of his fellow service members were war criminals. I would never forget him for that alone. Before we even get to the fact that he was a bit of a gas bag of a, senator, a bit of a gas bag of a Secretary of State, didn't do much of anything that was worthwhile in either of those jobs. And if you disagree with me, I'd be glad to take the naysayer call from anybody who wants to tell me all the wonderful things that John Kerry got done as a U.S. Senator or as Secretary of State. Frankly, I can't find anything he did that he'd want to brag about. But one thing he did do, in addition to defaming his fellow members of the U.S. military as war criminals and doing it very, very publicly, he got a lot of attention for it, probably helped launch his political career, I have no doubt. So from a personal standpoint, John Kerry did for John Kerry what John Kerry wanted. He wanted to come back and be a big anti-war hero. He got that. He wanted to get elected to public office. He got that. And then I'm sure he leveraged the public office since he's famous. He marries one rich woman, then marries another rich woman, and becomes relatively rich himself. If you admire that kind of behavior, good for you. I don't. But the thing he did that I think was absolutely unconscionable, maybe not as bad as calling his fellow members of the United States military war criminals, was that he said in 1971, he gave back the medals he earned with his service in Vietnam. Now, anybody who earns medals, my dad and my mom both, of course, had medals that they had earned in their military service. Mom was 5 years, 1940 to 45. Dad was 1940 to 1961. He gave back his medals. He's entitled to do that. In fact, he famously said that he threw them over the fence at the White House as basically a symbol to Richard Nixon at the time. Now, all that's well and good. You can think what you like of Kerry. I don't think he's much use at all. I think he's a full-on hypocrite for flying around and burning up lots and lots of jet fuel and then telling the rest of us that we're ruining the planet by driving a car to the grocery store. Okay, if you can stomach that kind of hypocrisy, you probably like John Kerry. If so, good, because I don't like him. But then what did he do? He showed up this past weekend at the coronation of King Charles III. Now, I got to tell you, too, I don't have much use for royalty. I'm glad that America decided not to have royalty, even though there were plenty of people who were pushing George Washington to be king of the United States instead of president of the United States. Washington had his head about him. He did the right thing. So John Kerry, famously giving his medals back, throwing them over the fence of the White House, shows up at the coronation of King Charles, and what is right there on his left breast pocket but a big patch of medals? Hold on a second. Aren't those the medals that you said you gave back? He said, I decided to give them back to their country. That's what he said about those medals. He and a bunch of other anti-war veterans said, we decided to give those medals back to their country. Now, he gave away his medals, threw them away, didn't want them. And yet he shows up at a coronation decades later and says, I want to wear medals, so I'll look important like everybody else. And that's exactly what he did. As I said, it's hard for John Kerry to top his previous hypocrisy, military service, followed by defamation of the military in America, earning medals, and then giving them back, and then being a gas bag of the Secretary of State and not accomplishing much of anything, being a U.S. Senator, marrying well not once but twice in a row, and then showing up at a coronation complete with medals so that he can be important like everybody else who's there as well. Glad to take your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. Now, this level of hypocrisy, not John Kerry, but a different story, involves a young lady, a mother of three, by the name of Corey Darden Richens. She's from Summit County, Utah. Now, her husband died, and that's sad. But now she has been charged with first-degree aggravated murder and 3 counts of second-degree possession of a controlled substance. What do the police say she did? They say that she put fentanyl into a mixed drink that she gave to her husband. In other words, it sounds like the police are saying she murdered her husband. That is the charge. Now, of course, she has a right to her day in court. She actually wrote a grief book for children after her husband died. So she, if the police are right, she killed her husband and then used that occasion to pen a grief book for children about her husband's death and how she handled his passing, which, according to the police, she may have had a lot to do with. Her husband ended up dead with a level of fentanyl in his system that was 5 times the lethal dosage. I guess if you're going to murder somebody, I guess you have to make sure that you get it done and get it done for sure. According to the court documents, police obtained a search warrant for Corey's phone and computers and found multiple communications between her and an unnamed acquaintance. Yeah, you can just imagine where this case is going to go. But the hypocrisy of writing a book about the grief you felt after you allegedly killed your husband, that's almost as bad as John Kerry. From our email, Rick writes in, Lars, just a few facts that are unknown or not deemed newsworthy by a woman on television. I live in Gulfport, Mississippi. The shooting in that town was gang-related, took place in Ocean Springs, probably the most liberal town in Mississippi. Very artsy and historically impressed with themselves. Not the easiest place to get a permit to build a building. Good schools, excellent art festival. But when I drove through the town now, the police are few and far between. They used to be thick as mosquitoes on the bayou. The gangs originate in Moss Point, a depressed twin town to Pascagoula, the defense shipyards, in the opposite end of the county to Ocean Springs. Periodically, the police crack down, and they move their base of operation out of the town. The woman on The View cited this shooting as red state-related and mall-centered. Government Street is very touristy, eating places and expensive art shops, transitioning to more party spots going east away from the town center. No mall for miles, and the bluest town around here. We have constitutional carry, and I always have a .380 in my pocket, like everybody I know. But I had to pick a town where most people don't have guns, like Ocean Springs. That would be my first choice. Signed, Rick at the Beach. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. Well, every single year, science makes marvelous breakthroughs in medical treatment, creating those massive machines worth, in some cases, tens of millions of dollars. But should we instead be putting more of our focus on treatments that are a whole lot cheaper and perhaps easier to accomplish? Dr. Henry Miller joins me now, medical doctor, molecular biologist, and at the American Council on Science and Health, the Glenn Swagger Distinguished Fellow, founding director of the FDA's Office of Biotechnology, so he knows his stuff on the tech end of things. Doc, welcome back.
Good to be with you, Lars.
So you know that I love technology, especially if it makes sense economically and especially if it does amazing things you couldn't do before. But I think you're right in the piece you wrote for the American Council on Science and Health that maybe if we focused on some less expensive treatments that aren't as whiz-bang as the technology, we might actually get more done.
Yeah, I think there's a fascinating dichotomy here. The whiz-bang high-tech stuff is miraculous. Treating genetic diseases, individualized therapy for cancer, and so on, and also the big-ticket machines that you mentioned. But there are some very ingenious, and when you think about it, even obvious low-tech interventions that save lives and increase the quality of life. So a couple that I highlighted in the article are checklists in operating rooms or emergency rooms. It seems very obvious, and you would think that people had been doing this forever. But
you mean, hold on. When you say a checklist, do you mean like a protocol list? I've seen some of those. I've watched a lot of surgeries over the years as a reporter, and I remember one time seeing one where they had a protocol. I think some anesthetics can cause people to have a bad reaction, right? And they start to heat. I mean, literally, the patient heats up. And they had a protocol posted on the wall. I was reading it while I was waiting for a heart transplant we were going to watch. And it was inside of the surgery, and it literally said, "How do you take a patient whose temperature is going way out of control because of bad reaction anesthetic?" And I asked the doctor about it. He said, "Oh yeah, it's there because then we look at it and go, okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, that kind of checklist."
That kind of checklist. Things like if an anesthesiologist or a nurse anesthetist has to check the vital signs, blood pressure, pulse rate, oxygen saturation, every 10 minutes. And you have to put a little check mark to show that it was done. Otherwise, you can get distracted and lose it. And the other thing is that people actually, during operations, left things in the body when they closed. Sponges, that is, gauze pads, even metal implements that obviously caused problems down the road, and the patient would have to be opened up again. So you have a checklist to make sure you account for everything that goes into the patient and goes and comes out of the tray, and make sure that it's accounted for at the end. So checklists are very important. Another one that I thought was interesting was a Norwegian study of low impact flooring in facilities for the elderly. Falls are a terrible scourge. They're for the elderly. They cause morbidity and mortality and huge expense, and often are fatal ultimately. So they looked at this low impact flooring versus regular flooring, and they found that although the incidence, the frequency of falls was the same, injuries were much lower with the low impact flooring, and deaths were 3 times lower. So these are just common sense things.
Well, and all that would mean, Doc, even if you did it slow, on a slow basis, if you said to every nursing home and every assisted living center and all that, as you go in and remodel, and they do from time to time, when you replace this flooring, replace it with this other flooring, you could actually, it wouldn't have to cost much of anything at all, would it? If you were doing it in all new construction, not mandated, but because it's the best practice. And as you replace some old flooring, you replace it with the softer stuff, right?
Exactly. And it wouldn't look very elegant, but you could also use those thick rubber pads that professional chefs have in restaurant kitchens that they stand on, that are spongy and put less strain on your hips and knees. And you could have rolls of that maybe in the interim between the kind of remodeling that you're describing. And then there are sort of intermediate level tech interventions. There's a blood test called troponin that indicates the presence of a heart attack. That a test that's done routinely in an emergency room when somebody comes in with chest pain. Well, it used to be if you came in with chest pain and sweating, they would admit you to the hospital for a couple of days and watched your EKGs and watched the other cardiac enzymes. But if you have a normal troponin with chest pain, it's probably indigestion or musculoskeletal, and they send you home with a couple of aspirin. So that's another way to prevent unnecessary hospitalizations and all the stress that causes and the expense that causes. Very, very smart, and what I call intermediate tech.
Doc, I want to remind you of one. A few years ago, I think I remember you and I talked about this. There was some little like robot device. It didn't have to be a robot, but you'd wheel it into a room. Everybody would leave. It'd turn on an ultraviolet light, and it would literally sterilize everything. I mean, bugs that were on the walls died. Everything died. But and it wasn't very expensive. And I remember you saying if you cut hospital infections, that alone would save a lot of lives and a lot of money too, wouldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's another great example, Lars. And of course, along with that is your checklist for making sure that that's done before a new patient arrives, and maybe every day or every other day once after that, and also check off that the doctors and nurses wash their hands before they enter the room.
You'd think that you wouldn't have to remind doctors and nurses to wash their hands, right? But apparently you do.
You would think so, but people are distracted. It's just difficult sometimes. But again, a checklist ensures that it's done.
Well, I tell you, Doc, my dad, my late father, was a small airplane pilot as well as a bunch of other things he did, not professionally, but every pilot had this thing strapped to his leg that had a checklist. And you think, you've flown this plane a couple of hundred times. Why do you need a checklist? And you say, to make sure I do everything that I have to do before we take off. Turn on the carburetor heat and all that. That's Dr. Henry Miller from the American Council on Science and Health. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. What happens when the President of the United States, who has already invited the largest invasion of the American homeland of any president in history, 9 million illegals who've crossed into America in not quite 2.5 years since Joe Biden took the oath back in 2021 in January. Not even 2.5 years have passed. More than 9 million illegals have entered this country. And then what happens when the man who took an oath not just to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, but to faithfully execute the laws of this great country, what happens when the administration decides that just about the time the Department of Homeland Security is going to go out and do some targeted enforcement, immigration enforcement, and what does the administration do? They warn the illegal aliens where to stay away from. I'll get into the details of that story in just a moment. First, welcome to a Tuesday on the Lars Larson Show. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. You can send your emails to talk@larslarson.com. And, of course, you can always vote in our Twitter poll. Let me get to the question in a moment. First, what's coming up this hour? White privilege is so real that white liberal academics are now pretending to be minorities. Why do stories like this keep popping up? And is there a moral hazard to say if you're willing to say that you are something you're not? And there have been plenty of people who've done exactly that, and they get away with it, and they prosper. When you create that kind of moral hazard, would you not expect that some people are going to take advantage? California may be on the verge of giving out almost $1 trillion in reparations, but would all of that just be a colossal waste of our money? And frankly, it would create, as one essayist I saw today suggested, it would create a caste system for America. And when I say a caste system, I mean a system like India, where you are in your caste and you never leave it. You don't get a chance to move up. You don't move down. It is a system in which you say you are entitled to certain things depending on what qualifications you can show. In this case, racial qualifications. Why does corporate America support transgender athletes that are dominating over female athletes? And what message does that send to women in America when some of the biggest corporations out there say, we support the men who pretend to be women? And take a moment to cast a vote in my Twitter poll. You'll find the question 2 places, at Lars Larson Show on Twitter, apparently the new home of Tucker Carlson since Fox News gave him the boot, and I think he's going to prosper there as well. You can also find the Twitter poll question at larslarson.com, our website, where virtually everything is free, and certainly you can vote in our Twitter poll. Robert De Niro has just had a brand new child. It is his 7th child. And God bless him for the birth of that child. But he will be in his mid-90s at the time where his child is a teenager. Should anybody that old be making babies? I would say no to that question. You can answer any way you like. Congratulations to Robert De Niro on being a dad again. But do you think it's fair to the kids? And my only perspective on that comes from being born to a mother and father who were both in their 40s when I was born. In other words, biologically, they were old enough to be my grandparents. Now, did I love my mom and dad? Yes. Did I admire my mom? Yes. Did I admire my dad? He had a lot of things not to recommend him, including being a full-on and lifelong alcoholic. But having said that, having older parents probably has some advantages. I would imagine that some of you who've had older parents would also say it comes from with some deficits as well. Do I think Robert De Niro should have been fathering a child at the age of 79 so that by the time his child is 15 years old, he'll be in his mid-90s? I almost said 1990s. He's not that old. In his mid-90s by the time his child is 15 or 16 years of age. Is that good for the kid? I would say no to that. Now, yesterday I asked you, should Joe Biden let the Remain in Mexico policy expire or extend it? 94% of you said extend it. Only 6% of you said let it expire. Today's Twitter poll is brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. AMAC has the conservative values I believe in. I joined the group a long time ago, and you should too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC is better. Better for you and better for America. Now, let me tell you about the reporting on what Joe Biden and his administration have done. Oh, and a shout out to our friends on our affiliate station, KLCK. That's AM 1400 in the town of Goldendale, where you can hear great talk radio all day and find my show Monday through Friday. The New York Post reports that the Border Patrol Union, which is not exactly on the same page as Joe Biden, and God bless them for that. They've taken the right approach to this. They tore into Homeland Security this morning because what they said was public warnings about targeted immigration enforcement make a sad joke. Days after Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas and Vice President Kamala Harris, they called them clowns. And I think they are clowns. The National Border Patrol Council, which is the official union for Border Patrol agents, lashed out after a Monday press release announced the operations at the border crossing in El Paso, Texas, where thousands of migrants, this is from the Post, are waiting in the run-up to Title 42. Nothing like publicly announcing that dangerous people will be arrested while warning them ahead of time where to run and hide to avoid arrest. I think the Border Patrol Union is absolutely right. They say this entire operation is a sad joke, another pandering PR stunt. Serious law enforcement leaders don't behave this way. And I'd remind you, Joe Biden did take an oath to faithfully execute the laws of the United States. And if you're going to warn the bad guys ahead of time that the good guys, law enforcement, is coming, then you are subverting the efforts of all of those people in law enforcement. Oh, and by the way, how about considering this question? We almost make this a Twitter poll, although it's too easy. Is it a good idea to restart the bat virus research grant that funded the Wuhan lab? The National Institutes of Health has now begun to renew the research grant it canceled 3 years ago under Donald Trump. The original 2014 version of that grant funded the research into mixing various bat viruses to study SARS, the coronavirus that caused an outbreak in the early 2000s. The grant also funded research at the Coronavirus Research Lab in Wuhan, China. You know, the one where most of us suspect that's exactly where SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 came from. NIH has now brought back the same grant 3 years after Donald Trump suspended it. The new version of the award will once again go to, and here's a familiar name, EcoHealth Alliance, but they will not focus on mixing live bat viruses, and the Wuhan Institute of Virology will no longer be directly involved in the research. You have to ask yourself, why were American taxpayers paying for virus research in a Chinese lab at all? And why in the world were they funding research that appears to have perhaps led to an accident that released one of the deadliest pandemics that the world has ever seen? Coming up in a moment, California's Reparations Task Force has recommended the state spend upwards of $800 billion, or about 2.5 times the state's annual budget. But do racial reparations make sense? We're going to talk to a man who knows civil rights well, Bob Woodson, coming up next on the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a Tuesday, and California is proposing literally hundreds of billions of dollars in reparations, something I've always found a little bit ironic since in California, slavery was never legal. There were no slaves there. There were no official slave holders there. I know there were some practices that came close to that, but California, at the time of slavery, officially disagreed with slavery. and it would not conscience it. So there weren't any slaves in the state, and there weren't any slave holders in the state. And yet now California says that people in California, taxpayers, must pay hundreds of billions of dollars in reparations for something that state never took part in. And nobody alive there today was a slave, and nobody alive in California was a slave holder. And I thought when we're talking about a subject like this, we've got to discuss it with Bob Woodson, who, of course, you'll recognize from the show, civil rights veteran, urban community development leader, author and founder of the Woodson Center, and the author, along with the 1776 Unites Project, of the new book, Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. Bob, welcome back to the program.
Always a pleasure to be here.
So what should we make of California's plan to spend? I mean, the number keeps getting bigger all the time. Now they're talking $800 billion in reparations. It could push up as high as $1 trillion. And, of course, it would create different categories of people, I guess, based on your racial history. So now we're going back to a caste system of some kind. What should we make of that, Bob?
Well, I just think it's really insane. As a veteran of the civil rights movement, it's insulting the blacks for this even to be brought up as an issue. Tell me what problem this would solve. It raises this practical, logical, and moral problems too. The assumption is that all whites were villains and all blacks are victims. It conceals the fact that there were 3,700 free blacks that owned 13,000 slaves. Should the defendants of these receive reparations?
No.
By contrast, you had 50,000 slaves that were found freedom of the Underground Railroad by 3 black barbers in Toledo, Ohio, but they had a network of 1,200 white farmers and 2 Native American tribes who operated this liberating and free enterprise and enabled 50,000 blacks to escape slavery. Now, do those whites who are part of the abolitionist movement, do they pay reparations? I mean, it really gets quite ridiculous to even have such a discussion like this and have people take it seriously.
Bob, I agree with you. And in fact, when you get into the details, and I know they haven't written all of them, but California is literally saying, if you live in California and have for 10 years and you identify as black, which opens up a whole new window of things, you say, hold on, that means somebody who moved here in 2012, I don't live in California, but moved to California in 2012 and identifies as black, that person is entitled to reparations for things that happened 160, 70 years before they ever came to America? And apparently under the rules, they would qualify.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised if some blonde-haired, blue-eyed progressives who identify as black also show up with their hands out.
Well, and when you said what problem does it solve?
You're saying they defy biology and say, well, I feel that my real identity is black. If you're a male and you say that you believe that your real identity is female, they forget about biology. Let's see if they'll forget about biology when it comes to race.
Well, and you mentioned what does it solve? If I made the argument from the other side, since you and I are on the same page, and said, well, if you accept that decades of racism after slavery put black Americans at a disadvantage, how do you correct for that? Well, you allow them to have some money to start a business or to buy a house or any of the other things to try to make up for all those decades. But it doesn't necessarily even fix that problem, does it?
And first of all, nobody becomes wealthy through income transfers. I mean, look at people who hit the lottery. What happens to 70 to 80% of those who hit the lottery? Anytime you separate work from income, it always has a harmful effect on the person. We did this with welfare for 50 years, and that's where the black family was destroyed when you put government substituting for the father in the home. And again, that was a form of reparations. How effective was that?
No, it wasn't very effective at all, because anytime you say, I'm just going to hand it to you, if you look at what one of the phrases we always hear is generational wealth. I had a friend of mine who was beleaguered by somebody who came to him and said, well, you don't understand. You had generational wealth. He said, my dad was a mill worker and my mom had mental health problems and was effectively disabled by that. He said, believe me, we don't have any generational wealth in our family. There are an awful lot of white people who, even if mom and dad were rich, they didn't end up rich. They may have inherited a bit, but as you point out, a lot of people who easy come, easy go, get it for free and have it handed to them, end up, basically wasting it away.
Well, one of the people that we feature in our essays, Red, White, and Black, is a woman named Biddy Mason. She came to California from Salt Lake City when her slave master brought her there and didn't realize California was free, and a white judge freed her. She was illiterate with 3 children and was a midwife and saved her money for 10 years and bought land in what is downtown L.A. and became one of the wealthiest women, not wealthiest black women, the wealthiest women in California. And she was the founder of the AME Church there. Biddy Mason, born a slave, died a millionaire. And there are 25 other people like that. Only in America, with our system, can someone be born a slave and died a millionaire. 2 of them actually went back and purchased the plantations on which they were slaves. That's what we ought to be talking about, not reparations, but how did people manage to become millionaires or thrive in the presence of oppressive circumstances?
I'm talking to Bob Woodson. He's one of the authors of Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. I got to tell you, Bob, the story that always impressed me, and I love asking teachers if they teach kids about it, is Madam C.J. Walker. Would you mind telling my audience about what she managed to accomplish just in the early decades after slavery?
She was one of the richest black women in the country. She was a hairdresser and developed a line of beauty products for blacks and became a multi-millionaire, had a beautiful mansion in New York on the river. But she was just one of many that we chronicle in our book. There were whole towns in the city of Chicago in the Bronzeville section in 1929. There were 731 black-owned businesses and $100 million in real estate assets. And so there were several Black Wall Streets like that around the country.
And by the way,
you don't hear the progressives talking about that.
No, you don't. By the way, I've looked up before, but I looked at it again, make sure I was still current, Bob. And that is Madam C.J. Walker products are still for sale. You can find them at Walmart. So this woman became a millionaire. She employed a lot of black Americans because I imagine in those days other people would not employ them. And she decided to make her own money, and she did, and became a millionaire, as you said, was in very good situation. And she did it through hard work and being a great entrepreneur. We're going to advise people to grab a copy of that book, Bob. I very much appreciate your time always.
And thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. That's Bob Woodson. He is, of course, an author. He does date back to the civil rights movement. We won't ask him his age. We've done that before. And he's one of the authors of Red, White, and Black, Rescuing American History from Revisionists and Race Hustlers. You know, it'd be interesting to see what would happen if parents got a copy of that book and sent it to school with their kids. Say, read the book, kids, then go to school and ask your teacher, probably a liberal, probably not somebody who's ever heard of C.J. Walker. Ask your teacher, have you ever heard of this woman? And how did she get to be a millionaire back then? You got the Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm always glad to get your calls. I want to talk about moral hazard, and I'll explain what that is. I'm not a lawyer, thank God, but there is a thing called moral hazard, and it's when you make something attractive to do, even though it's wrong, even though it may be immoral, it may be illegal, and I think most people would look at it and say it's wrong, that you try to avoid moral hazard. For example, most companies will not let you insure a house you own for a huge amount more than the house is worth. I mean, if you own, let's say, a $300,000 house, and you say, well, I'd like to insure it for $20 million, and I'm willing to pay the premiums. The problem is, it creates a moral hazard. If your house just accidentally burns down and you get $20 million for your $300,000 house, there's a moral hazard there. They also use it in life insurance a lot. If you walked into a life insurance agent and you said, hey, I'd like to insure my husband for his life. He's the breadwinner in the family. He makes $100,000 a year. And you say, but I'd like to insure him for $20 million. It does create a moral hazard. The death of your husband is going to make you fabulously wealthy, and they say that creates a moral hazard. But there are other kinds of moral hazards as well. I want to talk about that when it comes to colleges, universities, and professors who might just lie about who they are and what's in their background because of that kind of moral hazard. First, though, our Twitter poll today, Robert De Niro has just welcomed his 7th child. And you say, well, Robert De Niro, he's a good actor. He's got lousy politics, in my view. But he has now 7 children. And I think any child is a blessing from God. But Robert De Niro is now 79 years old. And you say, well, that's okay. He fathered the child. He can do that at 79, I'm sure. It means that when his child is 15 or 16 years old, Robert De Niro is going to be in his mid-90s if he is still with us. And you say, well, how fair is it to a 15-year-old boy or girl to have a dad who is in his mid-90s, assuming he's still alive? Is that fair to the child, is the concern I've got. Because when it comes to babies, as I said, everyone is a blessing from God, but are you being fair to the child in the choices that you're making? To say, maybe this child will not be very old at all when Robert De Niro passes away. I miss the fact my parents were in their 40s, early 40s, when I was born, so my mom and dad were both considerably older than me. Biologically, they were old enough to be my grandparents. And my grandparents, well, my grandfather and grandmother on my mother's side died when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And I don't have a lot of memories of them because we live some distance from them. And so I didn't see them very often. And so therefore I barely knew them. My father's parents died before I was born. So I never had I had grandparents on one side till I was 5 or 6. I didn't have grandparents on the other side of my family at all because they were gone by the time I was born. And I've thought about that when I looked at this, and I would say, should anybody this old be making babies? I would answer that one no. And I think not because it's fair to Robert De Niro. I guess he has the right, like anybody else does, to father a child. But is he really being a father to the child if by the time, let's say, that child is 6 years old, he's going to be 85 if he is still with us? So I don't think it's fair to the kid. Today's question can be found at Lars Larson Show and at larslarson.com. Brought to you by AMAC, the Association of Mature American Citizens. And I can tell you from experience, it is a great conservative group. And I'm glad that I joined years and years ago. You should join too. Just go to amac.us or call 888-262-2006. AMAC's better for you and better for America. Now, let me tell you about the moral hazard. And we're going to see a lot more of this because of the very idea that has become popular lately that you can identify as anything you want. If you're a boy, you can identify as a girl. If you're a man, you can identify as a woman. And we've had some famous examples, like a woman named Rachel Dolezal, who told anybody who would listen that she was a Black American. She was, according to her family, according to her siblings, according to her parents, she was, in fact, a white American. But she said that she was Black. And she ended up getting a job in civil rights, and turned out she was a fraud. Now, that's a moral hazard. She managed to make money by lying about who she was, which is behavior I don't admire at all. Now, from Human Events, the story of a professor at where else? A very liberal university, UC Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, has now apologized for identifying as Native American when she is in fact white. And if the name Senator Elizabeth Warren occurs to you, yep, I thought of that too. So you've got a sociology professor by the name of Elizabeth Hoover, another Liz, published a lengthy statement yesterday explaining that she was not a member of the Native American tribes that she had been told she was a member of when she was growing up. In other words, she used the same kind of excuse that Elizabeth Warren, who we know as Pocahontas, had used, saying, well, my parents told me I was an Indian, so I was. Instead, she said, I am a white person. At a time when many people, this is from Human Events, are able to identify their way into victimhood, it is clear to see that Hoover identifying as a Native American would have a substantial upside, both financially and culturally. And at that point, I would point out to you, Elizabeth Warren identified herself as Native American, not just in casual conversation. She actually filed for her application for a bar license, not for a drinking kind of bar, but the lawyer kind of bar in Texas, and identified herself as Native American. The Daily Mail reports that Professor Hoover of UC Berkeley had used her fake identity as a Native American to win prestigious jobs, grants, and fellowships, to publish books and papers, and even go on to become a prominent figure in what is known as the food sovereignty movement. Hoover had apparently long claimed that she is a member of the Mohawk and Micmac communities, even making references to her fraudulent heritage in news accounts and her doctoral dissertation for Brown University. She also admitted in her statement she did not investigate her heritage, but rather relied on family stories she was told when she was growing up. I think that's rather thin. I mean, the fact is, I think I can tell you much of my history. I'm not claiming to be a Native American. I'm not. I was born of a mother and a father, father from Michigan, mother from Nebraska originally, although her folks moved out to Southern California because my granddad worked in the aircraft industry in Long Beach. That's what I know about my background. But I don't believe in making false claims about who you are and what you do. I mean, after all, we've got a president right now in Joe Biden who would lie. He even lies today that he's been a long-haul truck driver, that he graduated top of his class in law school. I mean, all kinds of lies. You know, he borrows speeches, he borrows other people's backstory, and it's just wrong. I don't think people should do that. And when it comes to identifying yourself as part of a minority group like Native Americans, and you know that within academics that you're going to be viewed as special. I mean, Elizabeth Warren was viewed as special when she went on the faculty at Harvard. She ended up getting a very nice teaching arrangement at Harvard. She was paid a huge amount of money, and the university bragged that she was the first Native American woman to achieve that kind of stature. That kind of moral hazard is absolutely evil as far as I'm concerned. Evil when Elizabeth Warren did it, evil when Professor Elizabeth Hoover of UC Berkeley did it, and you kind of wonder, does the university have any choice but to perhaps fire her? So far, I see no indication that's happened yet. But if somebody faked their way into that kind of position, should they be welcome to stay? I don't think so. Glad to be with you and always glad to take your calls. Coming up in a moment, from swimming to running and weightlifting, the people who were born men are dominating women's sports these days. Why is corporate America going along with that? We'll talk about it next.
I got this little nugget of an idea from my dad. He used to watch me run and say, "Ain't no woman alive that can beat you." And I believed him. He made me feel invincible. It wasn't easy. I trained hard, harder than anyone else I know. But I was made for this. I was an unstoppable force, a life dedicated to perfection. But even perfection wouldn't be enough.
Now, you're hearing the audio from an ad that's being run by the eGuard Watch Company, and I want to talk to the man who's the CEO of the company, but what that ad is about, and I know it loses something because you're not seeing the video, but we'll post it on my website so you can see all of it. It's an ad called Erased, and it's about timeless values. Now, eGuard Watch Company makes some very interesting watches. I don't have a dog in the fight. I do like watches, so you can all say, okay, boomer, because I still believe in wearing wristwatches, and I actually like them. But Elon Srulovitz joins me now, who's founder and the CEO of eGuard Watch Company. You decided to put together an ad, Mr. Srulovitz, that about a young lady who's training for years to outdo her competition, be the best runner in the world, and then she realizes she's going to be running against a trans runner who's a biological male, and all of her hard work is going to be for nothing. Welcome to the program, and tell me why you decided to take this stance. And I'm proud that you did. I'm glad you did. Even though you and I have never met, I don't have any dog in the fight, as I tell my audience. I'll always disclose a dog in the fight. Why did you decide to do this when so many other companies are going woke and trying to embrace this ridiculousness?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. And for that very reason, I feel like there's a general narrative in society, which is an anti-truth-based narrative, which is going to have long-term consequences. And one of the ways to highlight it, I felt most efficiently, especially after the whole Dylan Mulvaney thing with numerous companies, was to kind of find a humanizing approach and show what this girl works for, spends her whole life trying to achieve, just to be ruined because of an unfair advantage due to society accepting things that are so outside the realm of common sense that we should all be against it.
I'm with you, because I'll tell you, Mr. Srulovitz, over the last 2-3 years that we've been talking about this, running is one of the things I bring up all the time, because I say, look, men beat the 4-minute mile in the 1950s. Women aren't even close. They're usually about 20 seconds behind, which in running, I'm not a track and field guy, but I know that in running, 20 seconds is a lifetime. So if after decades women have never even come close, have not broken the 4-minute mile, last time I checked, then they're forever going to be at a disadvantage to biological males. And we have to push back against this, I believe, and I'm glad to see you do it.
Yeah, I mean, it starts with sports, and then it's really just about the acceptance, again, of things that are outside the realm of truth, which permeate much deeper into society. I mean, sports was the point I chose to highlight. You see it in powerlifting, you see it in MMA. Fallon Fox is nowhere near as effective an MMA fighter as a male, as a biological male, as they are as a trans female. And this person has broken a woman's skull. And so it's just troubling to see that society will accept these things. I mean, it's gone one step further into the prison system. We're now looking at children and giving them puberty blockers. I mean, we're just accepting a position that is dangerous, and no one's pushing back against it, especially corporations, Hollywood, all these institutions that should be setting culture and affecting culture are actually doing the opposite. So, that's why we took the stance we did.
Just so you know who's to credit for this, because I think you deserve the credit. Egard Watch Company, its CEO and founder is Elon Srulovitz, and the ad is called is it called Erased, but it's about timeless values. We're going to post the ad so that people can see it. But I've been surprised for the last 3 years, Mr. Srulovitz, that I've got a little granddaughter who's 7, and she's not in organized sports yet, but she probably will be, and she runs faster than I can run, And I just kept wondering, where are the parents and grandparents to stand up and say, you can't run biological, males against my daughter, against my granddaughter, because it's a losing proposition for her. And you're going to drive women away. And yet I haven't seen a lot of parents and grandparents stand up and say that.
Because we become a culture that is silenced by fear of consequence. And if you look at Americans historically, we've been the exact opposite. We've stood in the face of adversity. We've stood up for what we believe in. I mean, it's literally the First Amendment is you should not fear that. And I know people are going to say, oh, well, that's consequence from the government. Yes, but if we become a society that self-censors itself, then we're a society that is lost. And this is the direct consequence of it. It's these little kids who suffer the consequences of it. And we're allowing culture to change through our agreeableness or through our fear of whatever might happen to us. So I just don't think it works long term.
See, and the thing that offends me too, Mr. Srulovitz, is that when I started doing this show about 26 years ago, I said, naysayers go to the head of the line. My producer, she was a young lady. She thought I was crazy. She said, you mean people who disagree with you? I said, yeah. If my ideas don't stand up to some close scrutiny and hard questions, then I don't deserve to hold those, or I should go back and rethink them. Let me ask you about Egard Watch Company. When did you start that, and how are you doing?
I started the company in 2012. It was a way for me to honor my father. He helped me through some rough periods in my life. I had some health issues. Guy was willing to fly anywhere, take care of me no matter what, help my mental health when I was going through this physical stuff. It's hard when you're dealing with chronic illness. And so I ended up designing him this watch. I had a design background, and it's going great. We had tremendous support for this ad. I think that's important to note for other companies out there. You could put out these messages, and it will still help your company. It won't hurt your company. So that's just kind of what we're trying to keep telling people. It's like, no, this is a message you can say. and I'm thankful that people have been supporting us.
Well, Mr. Surlovitz, I'm really hoping that people watch because you mentioned, the Bud Light nonsense with Mulvaney. Bud Light is still suffering, and it appears that it's an accelerated suffering. They've lost something like 23 or 24% of the market share, and now other Anheuser-Busch brands are starting to lose as well. I've always said as a conservative, go woke, go broke. And it appears to, it depends on who it is, but Disney did it. Go woke, go broke. They lost big time. And there are other companies that are losing as well. And that's Americans saying, no, we're not going to go along with that. Please don't do that. Don't push these political messages down our throats and say you must agree. And if you decide to stand up and object to it, that you'll be punished for objecting to it. I don't think we're going to be willing to do that anymore. You can find them at eGuard Watch Company, and, of course, the ad as well. We'll put it up on our website as well. Anything else you want to tell people before I let you go, sir?
No, I think you summed it up perfectly, to be honest with you. Definitely seeing the consequences of companies doing that.
Well, congratulations on your success in the watch business. I know that I'm a boomer, so it's like nobody wears wristwatches anymore, Lars. They all look at their phones. You know what? I think they're beautiful timepieces, and I congratulate you on your success, and thank you so much for the time tonight. That's Elon Surlovitz, the CEO and founder of eGuard Watch Company. I'm glad to get your emails, too, and check out that ad. It really brings the point home. Send it to a few of your woke friends and see what they have to say about it. We'll put the link up so you can do it. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. Yes, there is a verdict in the Donald Trump trial. It's a battery and defamation case involving a woman by the name of E. Jean Carroll. We'll get you that verdict just as soon as we get it. The jury has not heard it yet, but we will get it to you when we can. But welcome to the Lars Larson Show, and glad to have you with me on a Tuesday. Do you have free speech rights at work? Now, this question comes up all the time, and I would say excluding jobs like mine, where my boss actually pays me to tell you what my opinion is and doesn't tell me what opinion to have. I make that up on my own. But at most jobs, do you have the right to engage in free speech? Could you, for example, work at a car dealership and tell your customers, you know that gasoline-powered cars are destroying the planet? Or work at a butcher shop and tell all your clients, all the customers who come in to buy meat and bacon, that meat is murder. Would you get away with that? If you worked at a Nordstrom store and you sold makeup, would you be able to tell your customers, you know they tussed some of this makeup on little baby bunny rabbits, and that's evil? I don't think so. For the most part, most bosses are smart enough to say, we're in a business to provide a service or to sell a product, and you don't get a chance at the job to be able to tell the customers what your political point of view is. If you want to do that on your own time, you go right ahead. You can't do that on the job. Well, now we've got a decision. It involves the Kroger grocery stores, in particular, the Fred Meyer and QFC stores of a big national chain called Kroger. And they have been told that some political messages are allowed to be expressed by employees, even if it may be a divisive message, even if it may make a lot of your customers angry, but you are allowed to have that point of view and wear buttons that display that point of view, but only if you're in a labor union. Now, this might make you want to ask, do union members have superior free speech rights to those who choose not to be in a labor union? Because about 94% of Americans who work do not belong to a labor union. Only 6% of workers belong to a labor union. They are very much in the minority. And can the government force your employer to allow you, the employee, to wear a divisive political message on your shirt or on your blouse or on your clothing somewhere? I'll tell you what, you shouldn't be able to do that. I don't think you should. Unless you work a job like mine where your opinion is your business, I think you keep your opinion to yourself. And I don't think the boss can force you into a particular point of view, nor can he allow his workplace to be used for that. But here's the way it was reported. Western Washington, Fred Meyer, and QFC stores unlawfully barred employees from wearing Black Lives Matter pins and face masks at work back in 2020. Now, the ruling came from a National Labor Relations Board judge. So this is about the lowest level of judge you can find. This is not a judge like one who decides criminal cases. It is an administrative law judge. And his finding actually matched up with the findings in 2021 by the National Labor Relations Board, which found that the stores violated federal labor law by prohibiting workers from wearing union-sponsored Black Lives Matter pins and by sending home workers who refused to remove them. This is so messed up I can't even begin to tell you, but I'm going to tell you. Let me get to that in a moment. First, welcome to the program. If you want to join the best conversation in talk journalism, it's right here every day at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. If you're a naysayer, we'll put you right to the head of the line at 866-439-5277. If you want to send an email, we make the address easy to remember, talk@larslarson.com. And if you want to answer our Twitter poll, I'll tell you about the question in a moment. We always put up a brand new question every day from the news of the day, so it's fresh and ripe. Now, a representative from Kroger, the big parent company of Fred Meyer and QFC, did not respond to requests for comment. I wish they had. And let me tell you why. I think when you go to work at any job, your job is to sell a product or to sell a service. Your job does not entitle you to use your workplace as a place to send political messages. I think that applies to the likes of Colin Kaepernick, who took a knee during the national anthem, and he said, well, I have a right to do that as an American citizen. You do, except you agreed to work for an organization called the National Football League, and they own the field. You're on their time, on their dime. You don't get a chance to use that stage for your own political purposes. And I think that applies whether you work in a tire shop or a grocery store or a clothing store, or whether you're a guy who cleans out sewers or paints houses. Doesn't matter what your job is. Your job is to do the job. And wearing something like a BLM pin, I mean, Black Lives Matter, as far as I'm concerned, in one way was a gigantic multi-million-dollar scam, where monies were scammed from both companies and individuals and stolen by some of the people involved in BLM. But even if they hadn't done that, remember what BLM is associated with. The phrase, burn this B word down, that was used in Ferguson, Missouri, to say, burn the town down. We're so unhappy. BLM has been associated with riots and looting and arson and about 36 murders nationwide. So do you want to have that kind of association? It also, as far as I'm concerned, and I've said this for the last 3 years, Black Lives Matter is by exclusion a racist, bigoted statement. What you're saying is some lives matter more than others. And in this case, the National Labor Relations Board, which is part of the Joe Biden administration, is saying if you're a union member, any message endorsed by the union is a political message you can wear on your shirt at work, whether your boss and the customers like it or not. Now, imagine what that means. It's one thing, and I would exclude this, it's one thing if you say, I want to organize a labor union, or I support Local 520 or 670 or whatever local you're a member of. You can do all that. That's union related. But what this decision says, and I'm reasonably certain it'll be thrown out by other courts, including, if necessary, up to and including the Supreme Court of the United States, what it says is any political message endorsed by the labor unions is welcome to be worn at your workplace. Well, that means since the labor unions are reliably liberal, they hew to the Democrat Party, they give virtually every dime of political contribution to the Democrat Party, they'll say, we support abortion rights. Even if half your customers say, but we don't want to hear that message. That any message that gets a union, a labor union's endorsement, may be worn by those employees as a union message. Well, hold on. That doesn't have anything to do with organizing or negotiating a new contract. All that has to do with is, what are the politics of labor unions in America? Hard to the left, which means that every political message that is hard to the left and supports the Democrat Party and liberal things like abortion will be supported, and you can wear it at work. All the conservative messages are, by exclusion, they are simply banned from the workplace. That doesn't make sense, nor do I think that just because you belong to a labor union that you have superior First Amendment free speech rights to my rights or anyone else's rights. Your phone calls are welcome. 866-HEY-LARS. and you're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll get to your phone calls and emails in a moment. I guess I learned from my parents who said if something sounds too good to be true, it probably and almost certainly is too good to be true, which makes it all the stranger when I see so many young Americans who say they love the idea of socialism. Now, I always remind myself, these are young people who grew up in a capitalist society that is the best place on planet Earth, affords the greatest level of freedom and opportunity because it's a capitalist society. When I look at the socialist societies of planet Earth, where you wouldn't want to move, places like Venezuela, the former Soviet Union, now Russia, China, which is more of a communist society, or say Cuba, you say, I don't want to go there. You say, well, those are full-on socialist. That's what socialism is. So why are there so many young Americans who are attracted to this idea? Well, the perfect guy to talk to is Bill Federer, nationally known historian, president of Amerisearch, Inc., which is a publishing company dedicated to researching America's noble heritage, and the best-selling author most recently of Socialism, The Real History from Plato to Present. Bill, welcome back to the program. How are you?
Oh, it's great to be with you.
I want to talk to you about this. Why is socialism so popular in some quarters, understanding that the guy you're talking to hates the idea of socialism?
Well, I start off with Plato. Why? Because he's the first one that talked about everybody owning everything in common. And it sounds nice till you think it through. Somebody has to be in the government handing out the common stuff. And they will always be tempted to want to funnel a little extra to their family and friends on the side and hold back from someone they don't like. And before you know it, it gets discretionary. And the saying is, he who holds the purse strings has the power. So every attempt at everybody owning everything equally always ends up with a deep state bureaucracy passing out favors to their friends with the most corrupt guy at the top. And one of the things I found interesting, people say, well, wasn't the early church socialist? No, the early church was the early church. Socialism is counterfeit early church, and the difference is between the word voluntary and involuntary, right? Early believers voluntarily sold their property, laid it at the feet of the apostles. They didn't have the Roman government take away their property and laid it at the feet of Pilate. When the children of Israel went into the promised land, every family was given property. If you own property, you can accumulate stuff. The Bible called that being blessed. And you can give away some of your stuff. The Bible called it charity. Well, Lenin said socialism is a transition phase to communism, and Karl Marx says communism can be summed up in one sentence: abolition of private property. So if you don't own anything, how can you be charitable, right? How can you give away what you don't have? What, are you going to break the law and now you're a thief? No, God entrusts you with stuff and then gives you opportunities to show on the outside the love of God that's on the inside. Now, I tell people, what if older fish could tell younger fish to stay away from shiny things dangling in the water? But they can't. And so every new generation of younger fish sees it and attracted and caught. Socialism is a shiny thing dangling in the water. Free food, free clothes, free education, free is attractive. But there's a hook. You give up control of your life.
Yeah, you do. And I guess my favorite example has always been more recent history than biblical history, although I very much, I'm a Protestant Christian, so I very much believe in Jesus Christ as my Savior. But on the economic side of things, you go to the first colonies in America, which were set up as commonwealths. Everybody's going to work hard. Everybody's going to produce, whether it's hunting deer or farming or building the village, and then we'll all draw from the community storehouse. And that literally killed people in some cases, and in other cases, they just escaped death when they said, okay, let's throw out the Commonwealth idea. Everybody grows for themselves. Everybody can trade with each other, and they started up basic capitalism to say it doesn't work if you all draw from the community storehouse, whether you work hard or not. And it literally did come very close to killing a lot of people.
Right. So the Pilgrims had no money, so they went to investors in England who had the London Company, and they lent them the money, but they formed a company with bylaws. And the bylaws said everything that they had gained from fishing, cooking, hunting, trading fish shall go into ye common stock, and everyone's livelihood shall come out of ye common stock. They tried it. They almost died. Governor William Bradford writes, the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. They knew they were trying to live out this Plato thing. He goes that the taking away of private property and possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. He says in this case, there was confusion. The young men who were able to do twice as much work as the old guy got paid the same. The old man considered it a indignity to be classed in labor with the young guy. And the women, he says that the wives were obliged to do service for other men, like cooking, washing their clothes, etc. They considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not allow it. He says that after much discussion, it was decided that every family would get their own plot of land. This made all hands more industrious. The women now went willingly into the field to plant corn and took their little ones with them, while before they would allege weakness, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So here they tried this owning everything in common. Nobody was motivated to do anything. They almost starved to death. They scrapped it. They get a nice harvest, and they have a Thanksgiving, and we celebrate the Thanksgiving.
But that came out of capitalism. I'm talking to Bill Federer, who's a historian, president of Amerisearch, and the author of Socialism, The Real History from Plato to Present. So is it possible that all these younger people, and it's generally younger people who are enamored with this idea, didn't get a decent history education when they were in either K-12 or university?
Oh, definitely. There's actually a concept called deconstruction, where you want to actually say negative things about a country's founders so people will be repulsed by them. Then you get them into neutral where they don't remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. It's a sales technique. If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is tell you negative things about the toothpaste you're currently brushing with. You're still brushing with that stuff. Haven't you read it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? You're repulsed by it. Now I have you in a neutral. You're open-minded. What are all the toothpaste out there? Then I give you my pitch for this tartar-controlled breath freshener stuff. Well, that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they say the founders were all chauvinists and took land from Indians and they had slaves, and the kids are repulsed by them. Now you got the kids in a neutral, and then you can give them your pitch for socialism or the different sexual agendas or Sharia or whatever. But it's an intentional tactic that George Orwell writes about in his book, 1984. One other thing I think is interesting is the tactics. So the most common form of government in world history is kings: Nimrod, Pharaoh, Caesar, Kaiser, Sultan. That's the norm. It's a gang style of structure. Democracies and republics are attempts to take the power of the king, give it to the people. But what if the king wants the power back? Does he just ask for it? No. So there's two methods in which people will give up control of their life. Fear: when people get afraid, they will trade freedom for security. And free stuff. It's like a drug dealer takes over a neighborhood two ways. He can come in with guns and get people in fear. They panic and agree to submit to the mob. But the other way is the drug dealer's so nice, he's giving away free drugs until you get hooked. And then you want some more free drugs? You're going to give up control of your life. You can sell yourself into prostitution. So that's the strategy. It's like a hunter catches animals through guns or bait. There's a back door and there's a front door. And so you see these things playing out in front of us right now. Get the whole world into fear. Let's panic. Let's give up all of our freedoms. And in exchange, there was an interesting quote from Peter Thiel, and he is the founder of PayPal.
Yep.
And this was last year, November 18th.
Say it quickly.
At Stanford. He says we should be more afraid of the Antichrist than afraid of Armageddon. In other words,
absolutely right. Bill Federer, the book is called Socialism, The Real History from Plato to Present. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to the Lars Larson Show. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'll get back to your phone calls and emails shortly. I want to talk about police. I want to talk about mass shootings. I want to talk about some of the lies that you've been told by the mainstream media. And let me call out one lie directly. Many times people promise to identify a lie. CNN and others have said why since the first of this year, we have had 220 some odd mass shootings in America. And then even the usually reliably left-wing Associated Press came out and said, nah, it's more like a tenth of that, about 22 of them. So just let me warn you that some of the news stories you're going to see have vast exaggerations booked into them. And I'd be willing to bet that Lance LaRusso would agree with that. Lance is the founder of the Blue Line Lawyer Institute, a former cop, and the author of the books When Cops Kill and Blue News, the proceeds of which go to police charities. Lance, welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
So tell me about this. Are Americans getting the straight story when it comes to mass shootings? I mean, they're always disturbing, but are we getting the straight data, or is this being exaggerated to meet some kind of political agenda?
That data has been exaggerated for years, probably more than 20 years. So the question, it's kind of like when people talk about children that die as a result of gunfire, and then you find out that the inner workings of the study talk about a child is anyone under the age of 18. So a 17-year-old gang member who's twice convicted of armed robbery, who's shooting at another gang member and shoots another gang member who's robbing him, results in a child being shot. So when we start talking about the mass shootings, there have been several definitions of a mass shooting. One of them is more than one person shot in one event. Well, that could be a murder-suicide. That could be more than one person shot during an armed robbery that has nothing to do with a, quote, mass shooting. And the FBI and several others have worked to try to develop some sort of a taxonomy. The problem is that when you start looking at the reasons for the attacks, some of them are unpalatable to people who are just pushing a gun control agenda as opposed to trying to reduce the carnage.
Two gangbangers get in a fight or a dispute over their territory, money, drugs, or whatever, and they settle their dispute with guns, and all of a sudden it becomes a mass shooting, and everybody thinks it's like what happened in Allen, Texas on Saturday at a mall, which is an entirely different matter, isn't it?
Well, it's true. And unfortunately, there are mass shootings that occur as a result of the two gang members you talked about shooting at each other at a party. So then you have and we've had situations where somebody was calling in that it was a mass shooting, and I can understand why the witnesses thought that. But really what it came down to is two knuckleheads decided to shoot at each other in a crowded area, and someone got killed. Multiple people were shot. So I think that anytime you have anything being reported, and I talk about this in my book, Blue News, all the profits go to law enforcement charities, but anytime you start talking about news or reporting things with an agenda at the outset, whether that's the agenda of the reporter or fairly it's the agenda of the audience, you're going to get facts that are distorted.
And by the way, Lance, I would even add, I've seen some studies on the numbers that say, well, children are those under 21. And if they're still going to high school, and believe it or not, there are some people who are going to high school into the 20-year range. You say, hold on, they're 20 and they're still in high school? Yeah, and we consider them children. They define things very differently. And also, when it comes to school shootings, often say, this is a school shooting. You say, no, it was a dispute between two drug dealers that happened to happen within a block of the school. And you say, well, that's a school shooting. You say, no, it depends on the definition. So I don't consider the school shooting like Columbine to be comparable to two gangbangers getting into a dispute somewhere nearby. What do we know about what happened at Allen, Texas on Saturday with 8 people dead and 7 people wounded, and even the motivation behind it? Because that one seems to have taken on a political tinge, too.
Well, they always do, and I think that part of the problem is you have an investigation that is going to be methodical by many different agencies, by the federal agencies getting involved in everything from looking at crimes that may have occurred across state lines to just tracking firearms. And it's going to take a while, and right now you have people speculating about the motivation. What really happened, and unfortunately it's what's getting lost in the media, is once again, despite the anti-cop rhetoric, when people were in trouble, they called law enforcement.
Yep.
Law enforcement officers rushed to the scene as quickly as they could, rushed towards the sound of gunfire, and saved people. That's what happened.
Do you mind if I add to that the police officer who responded was off duty? He wasn't there on duty. And why is that significant? Because they said the entire incident and the deaths and the injuries or wounding happened within 4 minutes. I mean, we have, there are communities that have terrific response time, but 4 minutes to get on scene and actually take action is too fast. I mean, most police agencies, unless they happen to be in the area, which has happened a couple of times, are not going to get effective confrontation of the bad guy within 4 minutes of the incident starting, which, as I understand the numbers in Allen, Texas, it was all over within 4 minutes.
Well, and that's not uncommon. When you do a breakdown of true active shooter situations, law enforcement officers get to the scene, but then listening for the sound of gunfire, they still have to go find the threat. And we saw that in one of the school shootings in Nashville. But the other thing that you have to realize is the presence of law enforcement officers, and that's why the Law Enforcement Officer Safety Act allows officers from any state to carry anywhere in the United States. And we have people that are trying to restrict that, just like trying to restrict law-abiding people from carrying firearms. When the incident is actually occurring, the only thing that is going to stop it is either the suicide of the shooter, which is the way a lot of them stop, or a person neutralizing the threat by shooting and killing the shooter or disarming them. But most of the time, it's impossible.
By the way, Lance, one of the things you said, I don't often disagree with you, but when you said, well, we always take a look at the motivation. We always look at what's going on behind it. In the Nashville shooter, they have a manifesto in which the shooter apparently explained what she was up to, except it was a transgender individual. So now it sounds like they've dropped the manifesto into some deep, dark hole somewhere, and we're never going, well, we won't see it for a long, long time because of perhaps the political and or personal motivations of the killer in that case. So they're going to be all over Mauricio Garcia from Allen, Texas. They're going to tell you all about the social media he did and everything else. But in Nashville, you're not going to hear that same treatment of the story because all of a sudden the mainstream media says, oh, transgender shooter? Yeah, we're not interested. Tell me about that.
Well, when I say we, obviously law enforcement is looking into the shooter. Now, what I have heard, and obviously I haven't seen it, but what I have heard, and this sometimes happens with the manifestos or with information that they find, is that the person has done enough research, has gathered enough intelligence that they don't want to release it because they're concerned about other targets being injured. Now, I don't know if that's the case or not. That has been one of the reasons. But no, the law enforcement is always looking into the manifestations and reasons why people would do something this crazy, because by society's definition, it's crazy. But we, in the American system, we have generally what's called the McNaughton standard, the officer at the arm test. Would this person have done the act that they did if a law enforcement officer was standing there? So just because someone does a heinous act doesn't mean that they're crazy. And that's part of the problem with trying to regulate guns. The people that are talking about the firearms, quite frankly, want to wave a magic wand and make all of them disappear. That is never going to happen. And when you start talking about areas of the country that have gun control, areas of the world, metropolitan London has 33 to 45 knife attacks a day. I don't think those folks feel much safer because they have gun control and can't protect themselves.
33 to 45 knife attacks a day because they have effective gun control, so it doesn't stop the violent crime. That's Lance LaRusso. His books benefit cop charities. When Cops Kill and Blue News. Lance, thanks very much. I appreciate the time. Back in a moment, we'll get to your calls at 866-HEY-LARS. You're listening to The Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network. Welcome back to The Lars Larson Show. So if you thought that America's border invasion up to this point, now 9 million people in not even 2.5 years under Joe Biden, 9 million illegal aliens have invaded the United States of America, came right across the border, and in many cases, if not most of the cases, the Border Patrol was told, process these people out. Take them into custody at the border where you find them, to give them a nice ride to the detention center. Give them a chance to get a shower and a shave, maybe a plate of food, some new clothing, spend a couple of nights sleeping on a real bed in the detention center, and then you get released. Except you don't just get released. As we found out over the last couple of years, the Biden administration has been taking your tax money and putting these people, illegal aliens who've come into the country without any right to be here whatsoever, none. And they've put them on airplanes at your expense. They put them on buses at your expense. And on the airplane side of it, it's even more outrageous. And remember, this is about to get much, much worse. It's more outrageous for this reason. If anybody, unless we got some illegal aliens in the audience today, and who knows, maybe we do, but if you're an American citizen or a green card holder or a visitor to the United States, if you go out to the airport, any airport, to get on a commercial airline flight, and you come up to that security line at TSA, they're going to ask you for a number of things. Put all your stuff on the belt, take off your shoes, go through the metal detector, go through the scanner. You're going to be scanned. But the one thing they're going to ask of everyone, even if you're traveling with no luggage, no carry-on, you got no metal in your pockets, you got no metal belt buckle or metal watch or anything else, they're going to ask you for picture ID. And you say, well, how's the illegal alien get on the airplane? The TSA will tell you, an American citizen, you have to show us picture ID. If you forgot your wallet at home, fortunately, I've never done that, but I've always thought about it on the way to the airport before I drive out my driveway. I feel for that wallet. Sometimes I even pull it out, make sure my driver's license is in it. Why? Because if I get to the airport and I don't have a driver's license, picture ID issued by the government, I can't get on the plane, period. But the illegal alien who shows up, you say, well, how are they identified? When they're stopped by the Border Patrol and the Border Patrol writes them a citation for entering the country illegally and tells them show up in court in probably a couple of years, and they never will. Most of them never will. Whatever name they give the Border Patrol, because most of them have no ID or they've even thrown it away. And why would you throw away your ID? Because you're actually from Cuba or Haiti or some other place. And that's inconvenient when you want to lie and say that you're from El Salvador or Honduras or Guatemala. And you certainly don't want to tell them you're from Mexico, and here's why. If you're from Mexico, Border Patrol can turn you around and take you right back across. But if you're from Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, other countries like that, then you get a chance to say, I'm fleeing persecution. Please let me come into the country illegally. And the Border Patrol under Joe Biden has said, yeah, sure, come on in, and we'll ask you to show up in court in a couple of years, and if you don't show, it's no big deal. We're not going to come after you. Just flee to a sanctuary city or a sanctuary state somewhere, and you're going to be just fine. Okay, that's how the system is working right now. That illegal aliens in many ways, one in particular, getting on the airplane, have more rights than you do as an American citizen. And not only that, if you want to fly somewhere on a commercial airplane, either you or the company you work for pays for the ticket. For the illegal alien, you think, well, if they paid several $1,000s to the cartels, the coyotes, to get them across the border, how are they affording an airplane flight anywhere in America? And the answer is the American taxpayer is paying the bill. Now, if that sounds right to any of you, I'd be glad to take the naysayer call at 866-HEY-LARS. That's 866-439-5277. You can send emails to talk@LarsLarson.com. I'd love to have a naysayer say, Lars, it's perfectly appropriate that we treat illegal aliens as though they have more rights than citizens do, and we should pay their bills. I'd love to have a naysayer tell me that. Most of them would be afraid to do that because they know what I'd come back at them with. But get this, the latest information as we head up to the expiration of what's called Title 42, which is always described as a Donald Trump policy. It's not. Title 42 is part of federal law. It was part of federal law before Donald Trump came down that escalator and announced for president in the summer of 2015. It's been on the books for decades. So when they call it a Donald Trump policy, the mainstream media is lying to you. They should know it's federal law. Donald Trump just decided to enforce the law and say, we're in a pandemic, we've got an emergency, we're going to turn a lot of people back. Joe Biden has decided to turn off the enforcement of Title 42. Now, let me give the latest that's come up. According to brand new reports, Title 42 is days away from simply going away. And everybody who knows this subject, even the folks who want the illegal aliens in America, have said the minute Title 42 goes away, there are tens of thousands of illegal aliens who plan to immediately cross America's border. The estimate is we may see where previously under the Obama administration, their Secretary of Homeland Security was asked, what do you consider an out-of-control border? And they said more than 1,000 crossings per day. Do you know what they're estimating after Title 42 goes away? 10,000 per day. So it is 10 times what the administration of Barack Obama defined as a crisis. According to new reports, the Biden administration has decided to authorize, quote, mass releases of illegal aliens into border communities if non-governmental organization shelters, NGOs, and CBP facilities do not have the capacity to hold them. 10,000 a day? Is there any question that they don't have the room for them? Shelters and facilities at this point, today, Tuesday, are already at capacity in every single sector around the border. One Border Patrol source had to say it without putting his name on it because otherwise he'd get in trouble with Slow Joe back at the White House. Quote, the dam is about to break. And according to multiple CBP sources, that's Customs and Border Protection, last night, CBP and Border Patrol leadership made the decision to authorize all Border Patrol sectors to begin safe street releases of migrants to communities across the border, saying if we don't have the capacity, and they don't, they're already out of capacity, then everybody gets released. 10,000 per day, 300,000 plus per month. So if you thought 9 million and counting was bad, and that's the number that have already crossed illegally into the country, can you imagine what's going to happen if in the next 2 years, a little less than 2 years, until the end of Joe Biden's current term, what if it's 12 million people? And all of those people, for the most part, are going to stay in the United States. And they're going to expect that we either provide them with jobs or provide them with housing, or provide them with medical care, and provide them with food, and provide all of their children with schooling, and it's going to be done at your expense. All of it, every single bit of it. And if you say, but my community already has crowded schools, already doesn't have enough teachers, already is short of housing, the answer is Joe Biden is putting all those millions of illegal aliens ahead of you, the American citizen and American taxpayer, and that's just dead wrong. You're listening to the Lars Larson Show and the Radio Northwest Network.